Welcome to Understanding Bias and How to Overcome It, navigating workplace bias with awareness and confidence. Whether you've personally experienced bias, witnessed it, or wondered how to challenge it more effectively, this session is for you. Bias shows up in countless ways, sometimes loud and obvious, but more often it's quiet and unspoken. It can shape who gets promoted, who gets heard, and who feels like they belong. And let's be honest. The impact of bias isn't just professional, it's personal. Maybe you've been talked over in a meeting, maybe you've been told to smile more or to be less direct. Maybe you've watched someone with less experience get more opportunity. You're not imagining it, but you're also not alone and you're not powerless. This training is about more than identifying bias, it's about disrupting it. Today, we'll explore the roots of unconscious bias, how it affects decision-making, and most important, how to shift behaviors and systems with intention, courage, and consistency, because real leadership isn't just about climbing a ladder, it's about making sure others can climb too. So let's get started, because together we rise. So let's get started by going over what we'll cover in this session. First, we're going to understand the difference between implicit and explicit bias, recognize how bias impacts women's careers, especially in promotions, negotiations, and leadership opportunities, learn and apply practical strategies to challenge and overcome bias, explore real-world examples of bias disruption in action, and then reflect on personal experiences and how to navigate bias with confidence. Let's take a moment of self-reflection before diving into the content. We need to understand our own perspectives and experiences related to workplace bias. So have you ever faced workplace bias? What was the situation and how did it affect you? Did you speak up? Why or why not? How did others respond? And what, if anything, do you wish you would have done differently? Reflection allows us to ground abstract concepts in real emotion and experience. This helps us recognize our own stories and how our stories make bias personal. And that's where transformation begins. What is bias? There are two primary types of bias we need to understand: explicit bias and implicit bias. Before we can challenge bias, we need to understand what it is and how it operates in our everyday lives. Bias is a tendency, either conscious or unconscious, that affects our judgment and decisions. It often shows up in subtle ways, shaping how we view others and how we respond to them, especially in professional settings. While bias can be rooted in race, gender, age, disability, or any number of identity markers, today we're focusing specifically on how gender bias affects women in the workplace. So first is explicit bias. It's conscious, deliberate thoughts or actions rooted in prejudice or stereotypes, whereas implicit bias are unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions. Explicit bias is the more obvious of the two. It refers to conscious beliefs or attitudes that someone is fully aware of and may even act on intentionally. These biases are often grounded in stereotypes and can show up in statements or actions that are openly prejudiced. For example, assuming that a woman with a young child will not be committed to a leadership role is an explicit bias. It reflects a conscious assumption that caregiving responsibilities automatically diminish a woman's professional drive or availability. These kinds of biases can directly block opportunities for advancement or lead to exclusion from critical conversations and projects. Implicit bias, on the other hand, is much more subtle and often more dangerous because it's harder to recognize. Implicit biases are unconscious attitudes or stereotypes that we all carry, even if we don't realize it. These biases are shaped by societal messages, media, and personal experiences, and they can influence how we evaluate others without any conscious intent. For instance, studies have shown that both men and women are more likely to interrupt women during meetings, often without realizing it. This kind of behavior sends an unspoken message about whose voice holds more weight, and over time, it can undermine a woman's authority, confidence, and career growth. It's important to understand that bias is not always malicious, but it is always impactful. Whether it's the result of a conscious belief or an unconscious reflex, bias affects hiring decisions, how people are recognized and rewarded, who gets leadership opportunities, and even how we perceive someone's competence or authority. Being aware of these two types of bias, explicit and implicit, is the first step towards challenging them and creating a workplace where everyone has a fair chance to thrive. How bias shows up in the workplace. Bias doesn't always announce itself with loud, overt discrimination. More often, it shows up in quiet, patterned ways woven into workplace norms, decisions, and feedback. When left unexamined, these patterns can hold back women from advancement, recognition, and opportunities to lead. So let's explore 3 key areas where bias frequently emerges: promotions, negotiations, and leadership perception. Promotions are a common place where bias operates beneath the surface. Research shows that men are often promoted based on their potential, while women are judged on their proven performance. This double standard means that a man may be seen as a promising leader, even if he lacks direct experience, while a woman with a strong track record might be overlooked because she hasn't proven herself enough. Compounding this is the language that's often used in performance reviews. Women's evaluations are more likely to contain vague feedback, terms like not assertive enough, too emotional, or needs to improve confidence, whereas men receive clearer, skill-based guidance. These subtle distinctions can drastically impact advancement opportunities. Bias also shows up in negotiations, where women who advocate for higher pay or leadership roles are more likely to be labeled as aggressive, demanding, or even ungrateful. This is sometimes called the backlash effect. The irony is that negotiating is often expected and rewarded in men, but penalized in women. As a result, some women may choose not to negotiate at all, not because they don't believe in their worth, but because they've internalized the risk of being perceived negatively. This internalized bias becomes a barrier to equitable compensation and career growth, often without anyone realizing it's happening. Finally, bias is deeply embedded in how we perceive leadership traits. Qualities like decisiveness, ambition, and confidence are often praised in male leaders, but those same traits in women may be judged more harshly. A confident woman might be called bossy, while an ambitious one could be seen as too much or too hard to work with. This is known as the likability penalty. The more a woman displays traditionally masculine leadership traits, the less likable she's been perceived. And yet, likability remains an unspoken requirement for many women to move forward in their careers. These biases, often invisible and unintended, have very real consequences. They affect how women are evaluated, how they're compensated, and whether they're seen as leadership material. The good news is, when we become aware of how these patterns show up, we can begin to challenge them, individually, interpersonally, and systemically. I'm wondering, have you ever seen these patterns at play in your workplace? Jamie Lopko is the Community Development Director for the City of Durango, Colorado, and one of the newest leaders on the executive team. But her path here was long and often painful, shaped by experiences of bias from the very beginning of her career. She spent over 17 years as a senior planner in Clearwater, Florida, and was passed over for promotion 4 times. It wasn't due to a lack of experience or results. Jamie was highly qualified. but she was also a woman in a male-dominated field where bias, both subtle and overt, shaped expectations and outcomes. One of her earliest encounters with bias came in college during a site planning project. She and her male partner turned in the exact same site plan, and she received a D, whereas he received an A. When she questioned the professor, his response was blunt and unapologetic. Because you're a woman, this is a man's field. That message stayed with her, not as a truth, but as a wound, one that reopened every time she was overlooked, talked over, or dismissed in a meeting. Jamie shared that for years she felt silence, like speaking up would be perceived as too much. Assertiveness, she learned, was labeled differently depending on who delivered it. She says, when men are powerful, it's respected, but when women are powerful, it's often labeled as difficult. Eventually, Jamie enrolled in a course on communicating with diplomacy and tact. During that course, a painful moment shifted everything. The instructor told her, "You're being a doormat." That comment hurt, but it also ignited something in her. Jamie realized she didn't want to show up in that way anymore. She wanted to be heard, respected, and understood without being harsh or silenced. She found her voice and, more importantly, the confidence to use it. Today, Jamie leads with strength and intention. She is learning to quiet the imposter syndrome that still sometimes whispers, "Do I belong here?" She reminds herself, "You've earned this. You do belong here." Jamie models that same care and intentionality in her own leadership. When a field inspector resigned suddenly after feeling undervalued, Jamie addressed her team head on. "This isn't okay. I'm here to support you. If you don't feel seen and heard, I want to know." She now prioritizes building relationships with her staff, understanding how they want to be recognized and what their goals are. It's a philosophy echoed by city manager Jose Madrigal, whom she praises for leading with listening and creating space for every voice. Jamie has never received woman-specific leadership training before, but after reflecting on her experiences from being told she didn't belong, to being passed over, to learning how to speak with power and grace, she sees how vital this kind of support truly is. Her advice to other women in leadership: own your power. You are enough. Don't let anyone question that. Confidence is everything. Now let's look at a case of bias disruption and the Boston Symphony Orchestra. For decades, major orchestras were overwhelmingly male, and when the Boston Symphony Orchestra implemented blind auditions where musicians performed behind a screen to conceal their identity, the number of women hired increased significantly. This is one of the most well-documented and eye-opening examples of how bias can influence decision-making, and even among experts is found in the world of classical music. For decades, top symphony orchestras across the U.S. were overwhelmingly male, despite an abundance of highly trained, talented female musicians. Many believed that men simply played better or had a more commanding presence, reinforcing long-held stereotypes about gender and artistic ability. But in the 1970s and 80s, the Boston Symphony Orchestra and several others began experimenting with a new approach to auditions. They introduced blind auditions, where musicians would perform behind a screen so that judges could not see the performer. They couldn't tell the musician's gender, their race, age, or appearance. Only the sound of the music that mattered. Almost immediately, the results changed. The number of women selected for orchestras rose significantly. In some cases, women were up to 50% more likely to advance to the next round of auditions simply because their identities were hidden. What changed wasn't the talent pool, it was the structure of the selection process. By removing visual and identity-based cues, orchestras eliminated the opportunity for unconscious bias to influence decision-making. The music was evaluated purely on merit. This case proves a critical point. Even well-intentioned decision-makers can unknowingly favor certain groups. often because of deep-seated cultural assumptions and unconscious bias. But when we design systems that intentionally reduce those biases, we don't just level the playing field, we create more inclusive and equitable outcomes for everyone. This lesson transcends music. It applies to hiring, promotions, performance reviews, and leadership selection. When we reimagine how we evaluate people by focusing on performance, not perception, we begin to dismantle the hidden barriers that keep women and other underrepresented groups from advancing. So the lesson here is that even well-intentioned decision makers can unknowingly favor certain groups. But when we design systems to reduce bias, we create more equitable results. Now let's look at our final case study in bias disruption at Accenture, a global consulting firm. They recognized that women and minorities were underrepresented in leadership, and rather than focusing solely on bias training, they embedded inclusion metrics into performance reviews for managers. Inclusion wasn't just a value, it became part of how leaders were evaluated and promoted. Bias training is an important first step, but for real, lasting change, this happens when inclusion is built into the very fabric of how the workplace operates. With hundreds and thousands of employees across more than 120 countries, like many large organizations, Accenture recognized that despite efforts to promote equity, women and underrepresented minorities remain significantly underrepresented in leadership roles. They realized that awareness wasn't enough. Systems had to change. Instead of relying solely on education and training to address bias, Accenture made the bold decision to embed inclusion directly into performance evaluations. Leaders weren't just expected to support diversity as a vague organizational value, they were held accountable for it as part of their own professional success. Managers were evaluated not only on their business results, but also on how well they fostered inclusive team environments, supported equitable development opportunities, and contributed to building a diverse leadership pipeline. This meant that inclusive leadership wasn't a nice to have. It became a measurable performance expectation tied to promotions, raises, and advancement. This strategic move shifted the culture from performative allyship to meaningful accountability. It made inclusion tangible, operational, and non-negotiable. When leaders knew their behavior and outcomes would be assessed through an inclusion lens, it changed how they hired, how they mentored, and how they led. What we can learn from this is that this case highlights a critical truth. Embedding equity into performance systems rather than relying solely on training is what drives real and sustainable cultural change. When inclusion becomes part of how leadership is measured and rewarded, it sends a clear message. Equity is not optional, it is essential. So think about what systems in your workplace could use a redesign to reduce bias, such as promotions, hiring, or evaluations. Strategies for disrupting bias. Recognizing bias is an important first step, but the real power comes in knowing how to interrupt it. Bias won't disappear overnight, but we can shift cultures and outcomes by being intentional, courageous, and consistent. Let's explore 5 actionable strategies that can help you disrupt bias, whether you're in a leadership position, part of a team, or just starting your career. Name it to tame it. One of the most effective ways to address bias is to name it when you see it. That doesn't mean calling someone out in a confrontational way. It means bringing awareness to the moment. Bias often operates invisibly, so by making it visible, you create space for reflection and correction. Try using language that invites curiosity rather than blame. For example, you might say, "Can we step back and ask if we're evaluating this candidate objectively?" Or, "I wonder if unconscious assumptions might be playing a role here." These phrases can shift the conversation and open the door to more equitable decision-making. Normalize feedback and mentorship. Women, particularly women of color, are less likely to receive specific, actionable feedback in the workplace. Instead, they often receive vague or personality-focused comments like, "You're not confident enough," or "You need to be more polished," which don't offer a roadmap for growth. One way to disrupt bias is to normalize growth-oriented feedback for everyone, ensuring clarity and fairness. Additionally, mentorship and sponsorship are critical tools for inclusion. While mentors offer guidance, sponsors use their influence to advocate for someone's advancement. Be intentional about mentoring and sponsoring women and marginalized colleagues. It's one of the most powerful ways to close opportunity gaps. Prepare for the moment. Bias can catch us off guard, so it helps to have a few go-to phrases ready when you need them. If you notice someone's being dismissed or judged unfairly, try saying something like, "I noticed," and then you name the situation. "Can we talk about how that might be interpreted differently?" Or, "Let's make sure everyone's voice is heard here." Now, these are simple statements that can gently redirect the conversation and ensure inclusion without putting anyone on the defensive. Having language ready helps you respond confidently and calmly, even in high-pressure situations. Advocate for policy change. While individual actions matter, real progress also requires systematic change. Advocating for policies that promote fairness can significantly reduce the influence of bias across the organization. Support practices like blind resume screening, which removes names and identifying information to help reduce unconscious bias in hiring. Encourage ongoing bias awareness training and champion pay transparency to ensure compensation is based on value and performance, not assumptions. Structural shifts like these signal that inclusion is not just a personal value, it's an organizational priority. Support and amplify others. Finally, one of the most effective ways to disrupt bias is by using your voice to amplify others, especially when someone is being overlooked or interrupted. It might sound simple, but statements like, "I'd like to return to what Tanya just said. It was a great point," or "Let's make sure we hear from everyone before moving on," can make a profound difference. Amplifying someone's voice helps ensure their contributions are recognized, encourages participation, and demonstrates allyship in real time. Together, these strategies can help create environments where people are evaluated based on their ideas, talents, and potential, not their gender, identity, or perceived fit. You don't need a title to lead inclusively, just a commitment to speak up, to step up, and to support equity in action. Now let's look at how we partner for progress with our male allies. Because men continue to hold the majority of senior leadership positions in most industries around the world, and that means they often have greater access to influence, decision-making, and resources. When male leaders use their voices and their platforms to advocate for inclusion, they can help open doors that might otherwise remain closed. It's not about speaking for women, it's about standing with women. A male ally listens, learns, and lends his support in ways that amplify voices that have historically been overlooked. Advocacy from men in power can help shift norms, challenge the status quo, and accelerate change in meaningful ways. Let's look at the he for she movement. When we talk about advancing women in leadership and addressing bias, it's easy to assume the conversation is only for women, but the truth is gender equity is everyone's responsibility, and that includes men. In fact, male allies can play a uniquely powerful role in driving cultural change. One powerful example of this is in the action of the He for She movement launched by the UN Women. This global initiative invites men to actively participate in the fight for gender equality, not as bystanders, but as co-creators of change. When actor and activist Emma Watson introduced the campaign at the United Nations, she issued a bold and urgent challenge to men to recognize that gender equity is not just a woman's issue, but a human rights issue, one that affects all of us. Her message, resounded. Since its launch, He for She has gained the support of male leaders across the globe, from CEOs to heads of state, who have made public commitments to challenge gender imbalance within their organizations and communities. The movement is a reminder that when men step up as allies, they help normalize equity, model inclusive leadership, and create safer, more supportive workplaces for everyone. Real allyship requires more than good intentions. It calls for accountability, action, and a willingness to share. And when that happens, change isn't just possible, it's inevitable. We can't achieve full inclusion without the active involvement of those who currently hold power. Male allies are not the solution on their own, but when they pair their influence with humility, curiosity, and action, they become part of a broader movement that benefits all genders. True allyship is not performative, it's participatory. So what can our male allies do? Because it's not enough to believe in equity, allyship requires action. Men who want to support gender equity in meaningful ways can start by showing up intentionally, listening actively, and using their influence to shift the system, not just the conversation. Here are a few ways that our male allies can make a real difference. First, interrupt bias when you see it. Whether it's a woman being interrupted in a meeting, a biased comment about a leadership ability, or an unfair assumption in a hiring decision, say something. Use your voice to disrupt a pattern. A simple, "let's hear her out," or "can we take a step back and look at this more objectively?" can create a rippled effect. Silence reinforces bias, where speaking up challenges it. Second, mentor and sponsor women. Women, especially women of color, are less likely to have access to powerful networks or decision makers. Be the connection. Mentorship helps build confidence and skill. Sponsorship goes a step further, using your influence to open doors, advocate for promotions, and nominate women for stretch assignments or leadership roles. Because it's not just about advice, it's about access. And third, share leadership space. True allyship means recognizing when it's your turn to step back and amplify someone else's voice. Invite women to lead high visibility projects, co-present in meetings, and take the mic in key moments. Make room at the table, not just symbolically, but substantively, by sharing credit, responsibilities, and recognition. And then finally, acknowledge privilege and create access for others. Privilege isn't something to feel guilty about, it's something to be aware of and use responsibly. Acknowledge that your path may have been eased by systems built to benefit you, and then ask, how can I use what I have to create space for someone else? Whether it's nominating a woman for a leadership position, supporting parental leave policies, or advocating for equity-based initiatives, leverage your platform for progress. Males, I encourage you to reflect on how you can be an effective ally. Now let's take a global perspective. Let's take a look at how bias plays out around the world. Let's start with Japan. Bias is a global issue, but how it shows up can vary dramatically across cultures. In many countries, including those with high levels of education and economic development, deep-rooted cultural norms still shape opportunities for women. Japan offers a clear example of this. In Japan, women consistently achieve high levels of education and make up a significant portion of the workforce. Yet when it comes to leadership, the numbers tell a different story. Women remain significantly underrepresented in executive and decision-making roles across both public and private sectors. The reason? Strong traditional gender roles continue to influence both expectations and workplace structures. Social norms often reinforce the idea that women should prioritize family over career, and corporate culture tends to favor long hours and rigid hierarchies, factors that can disproportionately impact women's advancement. But change is happening. Progressive companies like Shiseido, one of Japan's largest cosmetic and personal care firms, are leading the way by taking intentional steps to disrupt systemic bias. Shiseido has introduced leadership quotas to increase the number of women in management roles and has launched mentorship and development programs specifically designed to support women's growth within the organization. These efforts send a powerful message. Gender equity isn't just a social goal, it's a business imperative. The lesson from Japan is clear. Bias can persist even in highly developed nations when culture and systems go unchallenged. But when organizations commit to intentional strategies like quotas, mentorship, and inclusiveness policies, they can begin to shift long-standing norms and pave the way for lasting change. Now let's shift to Scandinavia. Scandinavian countries such as Norway, Sweden, and Finland are often seen as global leaders in gender equity. And for good reason. These nations have implemented some of the world's most progressive policies around parental leave, pay equity, and workplace inclusion. But one of the most notable and bold moves came from Norway, which became the first country to legally mandate gender representation on corporate boards. In 2003, Norway passed legislation requiring at least 40% of board seats in publicly listed companies be held by women. The move was controversial at the time, and critics argued that it would lead to tokenism or undermine qualifications. But over time, the policy proved something powerful. When women are given access to leadership opportunities, they excel. The presence of women at the top has helped shift perceptions of leadership and normalize diversity in decision-making spaces. That said, even in Scandinavia, bias hasn't disappeared. Cultural expectations still exist, and women may face subtle barriers such as being passed over for informal networking opportunities or not being perceived as natural leaders. But what sets these countries apart is their willingness to acknowledge those gaps and to implement policies that actively counter them. The big takeaway? Policy drives access, and access can challenge bias. By mandating representation, Scandinavian countries didn't eliminate bias overnight, but they created conditions where opportunity became the norm, not the exception. Over time, this kind of structural change doesn't just diversify leadership, it reshapes cultural expectations of who belongs there. And finally, the Middle East and North Africa. In many parts of the Middle East and North Africa, women continue to face explicit legal, cultural, and institutional barriers to leadership. Gender roles are often deeply rooted in tradition, reinforced by societal norms, legal systems, and long-standing expectations around family and work. In some countries, women need male permission to travel, work, or make financial decisions, creating structural challenges that limit autonomy and advancement. But despite these barriers, women across the region are challenging the status quo and driving meaningful change. A trailblazing example is Sheikha Lubna al-Qasimi, the first female minister in the United Arab Emirates. Appointed as Minister of the Economy in 2004, she broke through what was once considered an impenetrable glass ceiling in the Gulf region. Her leadership marked a turning point, not just in policy but in perception. She went on to hold several ministerial roles, including the Minister of Tolerance and Minister of State for International Cooperation, paving the way for a new generation of women leaders across the UAE and beyond. Sheikha Lubna's success sent a powerful message. When women lead, change follows. Her appointment helped normalize the presence of women in high-level government roles, challenging long-standing assumptions about what leadership looks like in the Arab world. Today, more women are stepping into influential positions in the region, often in face of resistance. Many are building businesses, launching advocacy movements, or influencing public policy. While progress is uneven and barriers remain, these leaders are creating pathways where none existed before, proving that cultural norms can evolve when courageous individuals step forward and systems begin to shift. So I'd like you to ask yourself, how might our cultural background influence the way we see bias or leadership potential? Think about that for a moment. Now it's time for a reflection. Have you ever witnessed bias and stayed silent? What might you do differently in the future after listening to this course? So you're probably asking yourself, so what can I do? Let's come up with an action plan, because awareness is important, but it's action that truly drives change. As we wrap up this training, it's time to reflect on what each of us can do to disrupt bias in our own spheres of influence. You don't need a title or a formal leadership role to make a difference. Small, intentional actions taken consistently can ripple outward to create lasting impact. So here's your challenge. Choose one action that you can take this week. It doesn't have to be big or dramatic. The key is that it's intentional, doable, and meaningful to you. So here's a few ideas to get you started. First, call out a bias moment. The next time you hear a comment or witness a situation that reflects unconscious bias, speak up. It could be as simple as asking a question like, can we look at this from another perspective? Or how do we know we're being objective here? Because disruption doesn't always require confrontation. Sometimes it simply requires curiosity. 2, mentor someone. Think about someone on your team or in your network who could benefit from your support or your guidance or your encouragement. Reach out. Offer to meet them for coffee. Maybe review their resume or help them navigate a challenge. Better yet, ask how you can support their growth. And 3, advocate for a more inclusive policy. Look around your workplace. Are there hiring practices, performance reviews, or team dynamics that could be more equitable? Bring it up. Ask questions, offer solutions. Real change often starts with someone willing to say, we can do better. And number 4, share your own story of overcoming bias. Like we heard from Jamie earlier with the city of Durango, your experience has power. When you share how you faced and navigated bias, you create space for others to do the same. You model courage, you build connection, and you help shift culture one conversation at a time. Whatever action you choose, write it down, commit to it, share it with someone if you can, because when we move from awareness to action, even in small baby steps, we can help build the kind of workplace where everyone has a fair shot to lead, thrive, and belong. As we come to the end of this session, it's important to pause and reflect, not just on what we've learned, but on how we've grown. Every one of us enters conversations about bias with different lived experiences. Some of us have faced bias head-on. Others have unknowingly participated in bias systems. Most of us have done both. But what unites us here is the shared intention to do better, and that's where change begins. So take a moment. Think about how your perspective may have shifted throughout this training. I often tell my students, imagine yourself standing in one place and then walking for an hour in one direction and marking the end spot at that 1 hour point. And then going back to the beginning point, turning your body 1 degree and walking for an hour and marking that end point. When you measure those 2 end points, they're dramatically different, but you just had this one small shift. So ask yourself, what surprised you the most about how bias shows up in the workplace? Did you recognize any patterns in your own experience, either as someone affected by bias or someone in a position to interrupt it? What's one belief, behavior, or assumption you're now rethinking? And what's one thing, this is that 1 degree, what's one thing you're taking with you from this training that you didn't have before? An insight, a commitment, or a new awareness. Take a few moments to journal your thoughts or discuss them with a colleague. Transformation doesn't come from information. It comes from reflection and action. Remember, disrupting bias isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about noticing, naming, and nudging ourselves and others towards fairness and inclusion. As we wrap up today's session, remember, you're not doing this work alone. If you have any additional questions or comments, we invite you to join the Women's Leadership Support Group on LinkedIn. The Women's Leadership Support Network was created to be more than a place for training. It's a community, a space where women and allies can ask questions, share stories, find mentorship, and access real-time support as they navigate leadership, growth, and the challenges that come with it. We invite you to also join the conversation inside the private LinkedIn group, where you can reflect on today's training, connect with others doing this work, and be part of a movement that is redefining what leadership looks like, together. You'll also find tools, prompts, and opportunities to contribute your voice and uplift others. Because disrupting bias doesn't end here. It's in the way we lead, listen, and create space for one another every single day. Thank you for showing up, for being part of this work, and for committing to the change. One moment, one choice, and one conversation at a time. We look forward to seeing you in the next training in the series, and until then, keep rising and keep lifting others with you. We look forward to seeing you soon.